while the clock ticks for the Democratic Alliance to access the ANC's catered deployment records, the Blue Party has launched its election manifesto. Last week, we saw the EFF emphasizing land, jobs and ending load shedding. Similarly, the DA has its own blueprint to end the rolling blackouts, water shedding and the decline of infrastructure, while questioning the ruling party's Dintswalo narrative. Mathew Cuthbert, and DA's head of policy, joins us to unpack the party's election manifesto in greater detail. Matthew, thank you for your time and a good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Noluthando. Great to be speaking to you today.
Thank you so much for being here, Matthew. I think we know that the socioeconomic issues in South Africa right now are really at a front and center of any person's mind. I'm keen to get your thoughts as a Democratic Alliance, as you've put this manifesto together, how you've taken stock of this reality.
Sure. So I think that's an excellent question. And it's very important that any offer that a political party puts out in the current context is one that's in tune with the lived reality of South Africans and the fact that unemployment is the single biggest issue in this country. And I think it's so important that we're able to deliver a credible alternative to the status quo. When you sit with an unemployment rate that is north of 30%, youth unemployment close to 70%, and I think the deteriorating, nature of our treasury and the budget itself just shows how much less there is to go around for South Africans. And that's why in drafting this particular rescue plan, we've been very deliberate in making sure that it's largely revenue neutral, that we identify savings where necessary to fund other budget priorities, and to allow us to get a stable foundation in place so that we are actually able to deliver on the commitments that we have made over the next 5 years.
I'd like to look at some of the apex priorities which you have highlighted in the manifesto document, maybe starting with the big ones, Matthew: Eskom, Transnet, economic growth here. What is the DA committing to in those areas that have been a huge challenge for the private sector, but also starting to show up in the lives of ordinary South Africans, specifically at Transnet?
Fantastic. So you will see in our manifesto that we commit to reforming all network industries, right? And rail would be a predominant part of that. And ultimately, government does not have sufficient money to be able to undertake a large infrastructure build. And this is why it's so important for us to get the private sector on board and provide them with an enabling environment to help us deliver that kind of infrastructure. If we were looking at a much better fiscal situation, let's say 10, 15 years ago, then I think government would have been able to commit to more extensive expenditure. But we've seen all of the public-private partnerships that have been unleashed by government over the past few years have failed to materialize in a meaningful way. And that's why we are saying in opposition, listen here, we need to open it up to the private sector, allow them to be able to participate in rail, allow them to be able to participate in energy in particular, so that we're able to get growth right and we're able to have the fundamentals in place for key structural reforms to take hold. And I think particularly in the case of energy is most probably the single biggest crisis that we are facing in this country. It keeps us constrained to the 1% low growth trap. And it's urgent that we get an alternative solution on board that reduces reliance on Eskom and allows us to move towards a more diversified energy mix, and one which is sustainable and provides us with energy security.
What we are seeing, Matthew, is currently the ruling party looking at getting more private players involved in Eskom, involved in Transnet. So I take it the DA doesn't agree with that. Is the approach, what would be different from the DA's perspective?
So we do agree that there are private players being courted, but what has that materialized? And we look at ports in particular, how far has that come? It's not come very far. We still have some regulation that's contained within the energy space that makes it difficult for people to actually wield the electricity that they generate or store that electricity. There's also not sufficient transmission infrastructure. So what we're saying is we would emphasize the role of our private partners and make sure that we get them involved in a meaningful way so that we can unlock the kind of opportunities that they present us with. And we don't believe that the status quo and the government of the day is actually doing that in a meaningful way.
We also do see a promise here of 2 million jobs. Let's talk about this one, Matthew. In my mind, with the growth being so low, we don't even know if jobs are a chicken or an egg, at this point. I'm keen to get your thoughts here. 2 million jobs. How would the DA do that?
Certainly. So I think there's a number of things that need to be put in place. The first thing is we would radically overhaul the labor regulations that are in place and the labor legislation that is in place. So we talk about introducing a youth employment opportunity certificate, which basically gives long-term unemployed young people an opportunity to forego the minimum wage in some instances so that they are actually able to get their first job, be able to develop a livelihood for themselves, be able to build up experience and be marketable. Because it's proven that the longer that you are unemployed, the longer you are likely to remain unemployed. And we believe that this is a key mechanism to leverage to allow for particularly the manufacturing sector to absorb more labor in a meaningful way. We also look at making sure that we have an export-oriented economy where we have the necessary infrastructure in place to make sure that we can get our goods out of South Africa and we can make it easier for businesses to invest in South Africa and want to create jobs. So if you look across very labor-intensive sectors, I think that our plan and the kind of legislation and regulations we want to amend and the changes we want to introduce will be able to easily get to that 2 million number. And I don't think it's a significant number in the context of the environments in which we work, but I think with these key tweaks, we can get ourselves back on towards a job creation path. And then we have longer term interventions like education, where we will be able to solve those issues in maybe 5 to 10 years once we've got the fundamentals in place from an educational perspective. And I think that working hand in hand, those will be able to deliver exactly what it is that we need. I think another issue which I'd like to raise is particularly taxes. And we've committed to no new taxes. And as I said to you, our plan is largely revenue neutral. We're really trying to squeeze an immense amount out of approximately 5.2 million people, instead of trying to incentivize people to want to invest in this country and to create jobs. And I think we need to make it easier for the employers of this country to be able to do so. We also need to spur on enterprise and entrepreneurship, and we must do that by making it easier for people to start businesses. There's no doubt that there's been some progress made with the CPIC and so forth, but it's not significantly widespread enough in communities where people are trying to start businesses as informal traders or as SMMEs. And we've got to make it easier and more enabling environment for them to be able to do so, because we know that small businesses and single man entrepreneurs often contribute a significant amount of economic value to the broader basket.
Let's also touch on the issue of social protection. We know it's an important part of South Africans, just considering the kind of inequality we see in, our society. What's the DA's commitment there?
Sure. So the first proposal which we've put forward is increasing the child social grant by 250 Rand. And the belief in this is because we need to protect people from extreme poverty. We understand that grants are not an adequate substitute for jobs or for economic growth. But whilst we find ourselves in the situation that we do, we need to make sure that people are not going hungry and they're able to feed their families. And that's particularly important to us, is that while we generate a growing economy, we must make sure there's a strong social safety net in place. We also look at converting the SRD grant into a job seekers grant, and we progressively will realize over time, as revenue increases and we generate more growth, that we may be able to provide a more generous package to fewer individuals, because we'd have more people in employment and less people reliant on the state. And that's sort of an overview of what we're proposing in terms of our social measures. We think that purely by amending preferential procurement, and particularly with our alternative model, which we've introduced, there would be about an 80 billion Rand saving, which help us go away and plugging the fiscal gap that we currently have, and also allocating and redirecting that expenditure towards key frontline services as well as social assistance to the most vulnerable of South Africans.
Before I let you go, Mathew, I must ask the issue of Nasus. I think when the manifesto was released, it was a big issue on the social media here, with young people identifying the DA's intended policy for Nasus. And I'm keen to get more insights as to this, maybe with the context of the fact that in South Africa, those who do graduate are still not guaranteed a job. Of course, we are hearing now of a possibility of loans under the DA. Help us unpack the rationale behind this one.
Sure. So I think at the time of the introduction of free higher education, a number of economists, international institutions had warned of the kind of fiscal cost that this would come with. And there's no doubt that as the DA, we want to empower people with tertiary education. But if we assume that tertiary education is the only way to actually unlock opportunity, then that means that we haven't focused on improving our basic education sector. There's a number of studies across the world which show that we need to focus on basic education in particular and spend predominant amount of money on that if we want to have the kind of economic outcomes later on in life. And ultimately, it's a cost that the fiscus is very, very, unable to bear at this moment in time. And that's why we've decided that, in line with the commission at the time, it's important that we were able to switch it back to a loan system. And where, in the cases of merit and people have been able to succeed in their studies and achieve certain marks, we can provide scholarships. But we don't believe that it's currently sustainable. We also know that there's a 41 billion rand debtors book which has not been collected. And ultimately, if we want this to be a circular functioning entity, we need to make sure that money that was taken out is plowed back into the same kind of funding so that future students also have an opportunity to be able to access higher education. And such is the case in an economy that we're in and in the fiscal state that we're in. There are always going to be trade-offs. And ultimately, we need to consider what these costs are on frontline services and protecting the most vulnerable people from extreme poverty.
Well, Mathew, unfortunately, it's all we have time for today. I hope we can keep talking leading up to that national election. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And that was DA's Head of Policy, Mathew Cuthbert.